Thank you very much for the nice introduction. And as the rector said, I have heard that you are particularly interested in asking questions and in dialogue. So I'm also more interested in hearing your questions than hearing my speech. So I will make a compromise and give an introduction, 15-20 minutes, which should allow still half an hour or a little bit more for interaction with you and for responding to your questions. For 150 years, my organization, for more than 150 years actually, my organization has worked around the issue of assisting and protecting people through law, through diplomacy, and through operational activities. In the 19th century, when wars were waging in the middle of Europe, the impact of these wars, the negative impact on the economies and on societies, has basically given rise to the creation of the ICRC. But the ICRC was not created as an organization just to mitigate and bring relief. It was also created as an organization which should contribute to the development of international law and work with states so that law would happen within a legal framework. And the organization was not created just to assist people and, as I often say, throwing assistance at problems, but also changing the dynamic of violence and, as I often say today, shrinking the needs which comes with changing behaviors of belligerents. That's what we call protection. So it has not been created just to bring food, water, sanitation services, medicine, and shelter to people. It had also been created that belligerents would respect some minimal rules, and these minimal rules should prevent that war and violence would have a negative and a more negative impact on economies and societies. And I think this basic idea has accompanied the ICRC for the last 154 years now. And we have developed as an organization around the changing face of war and violence. In the 19th century, the primary victims of war were soldiers. That's the reason why the first Geneva Convention was focusing on how to assist and protect those who were not anymore participating in hostilities, the soldiers, how we could help them survive if they were wounded on the battlefield. In the First World War, the focus of ICRC shifted to prisoners of war, because the First World War was a war when, for the first time, big numbers of prisoners were made by belligerents. And so we started our tracing agency, which would allow the soldiers to notify the ICRC and the ICRC to know that the respective soldiers were prisoners on the respective other side. In the Second World War, our focus shifted even more to the protection of civilians, because it was the first war in modern history where the main victims were not soldiers, but the main victims were civilians. And this trend has continued, and the additional protocols of 1977 very much were protocols which focused on internal armed conflict instead of international armed conflict, and they focused on protection of civilians as well. So again, ICRC adapted its work and priorities to how the face of violence was developing. Now, I can tell you, in the history of the organization, the last 5-7 years have been particularly challenging. It is visible by the budget and by the personnel of ICRC. In the last 6 years, ICRC doubled its budget. So something has happened in war, in violence today. And also we increased considerably our personnel. So we increased our surface because violence and war again has and is changing its face. What are the key characteristics of what we see today? Violence and warfare are increasingly fragmented. Actors in war are extremely fragmented. Our key interlocutors to assist and protect are not anymore structured armies from parties to conflict, but are very often increasing fragmented armed groups. Today, when we work in Syria, for instance, we negotiate over 30, 40, 50 checkpoints if we have assistance delivery from Damascus to some parts of Syria occupied by opposing factions. So we are increasingly confronted with fragmented landscape of actors, and sometimes we don't even know those actors anymore. A second trend which we see is also that the impact of violence and warfare is increasingly affecting deeply societies. We have not only individuals which are affected by the war, but whole social systems are falling apart. Health system, education systems are victims of today's warfares in particular. A third element which preoccupies us is that wars are increasingly long-term. We have been 60 years in Yemen, we have been 45 years in Iraq, we have been 50 years in the DRC. The average presence of ICRC in today's warfare is in the 10 largest operation of ICRC is 36 years. So we have been created as an emergency organization for short-term relief, while at the end of the day today, we stay an average of 36 years in theaters of conflict. And what finally has changed in today's environment is that we have much more massive impact of war and violence on people. And what do I mean? If you see it in figures, we have 65 million people displaced by violence in the world today, which is more than ever since the Second World War. We have 135 million people who need humanitarian assistance in today's world. When I came for the first time, still as a Swiss diplomat 10 years ago, to the United Nations, and I was permanent representative, the budget of the UN in humanitarian affairs was 2 billion. Today it's 27 billion. So you see that the impact of war has changed in dynamics. So we see fragmented actors, long-term warfare, systemic impact, and an increasing cost of conflict. 10% of the global GDP is today estimated as being the cost of conflict and war in today's world, which is a huge burden on societies and on economy. And finally, what we see in today's world is also that violence is not anymore in a very clinically way to separate into political violence or warfare compared to criminal violence. In today's contexts and operation, we see increasingly 3 or 4 origins of violence at the same time. We have political violence, we have criminal violence, we have inter-community violence at the same time. And this creates fragility and problems to societies which we haven't seen in these dimensions before. But it also causes a big problem to an organization like mine, which has been used to work in the framework of the Geneva Conventions. In the Geneva Convention, you have only international armed conflict, internal armed conflict, and then you have other situations of violence which you don't really are able to categorize. But most of the rules and regulations are about international armed conflict and internal armed conflict. But today, very often you can't distinguish what you are dealing with. Take the example of Myanmar. In Myanmar, we have seen after 25 of August an enormous outburst of violence with 600-700 people, Rohingyas, displaced into Bangladesh. What was the origin of violence? It started with attacks and internal armed conflict between ARSA, the Muslim armed opposition in northern Rakhine, against the Myanmar army, which retaliated. So this was according to the category of international law and internal armed conflict. But this internal armed conflict led immediately to inter-community violence at large scale. Populations, Muslim and Buddhist populations, started to exert violence against each other. Much of it was unorganized violence, and it led to massive displacement. And because in many places the legal order and the state order was inexistent after this outburst of violence, you have crime at the same time. So we are confronted increasingly with a very complex environment in which violence destroys system, violence destroys development, lack of development leads to more violence, and violence and fragility are spreading, so that the impact of it is huge. So what kind of inspiration do we take as ICRC from the Geneva Conventions, from international law, when we deal with these complex situations? I think what we see today is an increased importance to be able to reach out, to engage, to dialogue, to explain, to train in international humanitarian law, to negotiate international situations in which ICRC can be active, to convince an increasing number of fragmented actors in the field to respect basic principles of law. Because we are in a multicultural environment, we are increasingly forced to speak, educate, and talk and translate international humanitarian law into other conceptual systems. ICRC has 70% of its operations in Muslim countries. So we can't just read the Geneva Conventions, we have to translate the norms of the limitation of warfare into categories and terms and terminologies understood in Muslim countries, and therefore we do this translation in talking to Islamic scholars and in basically working on the adequacy of international humanitarian law and Muslim and Islamic law. Because when we talk to fighters on the ground, we need to talk in a language which is understood by the fighters. So if you want to convince them to respect the law, you have to translate the law and adapt it to new reality. So dialogue on the ground, on the front lines, is one of the critical issues. As I mentioned beforehand, while we strongly believe that the Geneva Convention and its legal framework is customary international law which has to be respected in all circumstances, we also see the necessity to constantly explain to the belligerent what we are doing, why these are important norms on restraining violence and its impact on the civilian populations. Many people today say international humanitarian law has become superfluous. It's not useful anymore. You see how much it is violated. Why wouldn't we even bother about international humanitarian law when it is violated to that extent? We have a very different opinion, and our experience tells a very different story. The basic norms of international humanitarian law, be it expressed in Buddhist, Islamic, Christian, or legal categories, doesn't really make a difference. In many contexts in which we are, communities, community leaders, and belligerents do react to international humanitarian law, try to implement some of the legal provisions, and therefore access, presence on the ground, proximity to actors and perpetrators of violence, dialogue with those perpetrators is of absolute essence. This is how we create, in many of the conflicts in which we are active today, humanitarian spaces where less violence is happening and access to communities and humanitarian services can be provided. And this methodology of talking to all armed actors in control of territory and populations, trying to convince them about the accuracy and importance of respecting, restraining rules in the use of force, trying to respect the dignity of detainees, trying to have families reunified. This is what we are doing in concrete contexts. And we are doing this in many places where no other humanitarian actor is really active, at least no international actor. That's the reason why ICRC is at the present moment the only international actor in the Luhansk and Donetsk Republic, because no other international actor has managed to have the confidence and trust to talk to all sides of the conflict. This is one of the reasons why ICRC is active in the southern and central parts of Somalia, which are under control of Al-Shabaab. This is one of the reasons why ICRC is able to develop humanitarian activities in the north of Nigeria and in the Lake Chad region, which are heavily controlled by Boko Haram and other Islamic groups. This is the reason why we are active in rural Afghanistan, in northern Mali, and in other contexts in which we operate. Now, let me also say that if this is the landscape and the approaches which ICRC follows, we also recognize that today we have an increasing gap between our ability to negotiate humanitarian spaces, to access humanitarian spaces, to deliver humanitarian services, and the needs that are emerging from the level of violence and the dynamics of conflicts with which we are confronted. So what is the recipe to deal with this situation? There is no one recipe, of course, but it is very clear that ICRC today looks increasingly also at finding new ways and more innovative ways of delivering humanitarian services. Connectivity today is something which inspires us at ICRC and forces us to see how can we use modern technologies in order to reach and to assist and protect people. So increasingly, for instance, we use in situations wherever this is possible, we don't deliver anymore humanitarian goods and services to people, but we would give credits on cell phones, which allow people to buy humanitarian goods and goods which they need. For instance, in many parts of the world, people are connected and are connected by cell phone. And so the best way of delivering humanitarian services is not anymore to have 20 trucks full of goods go to a certain place and running the danger of being shot at, but it's much easier to deliver humanitarian services to people by transferring money. We have also started some pilot projects, innovative pilot projects, which are very effective and efficient in some of the contexts in which we work, in order to allow people to help themselves and not necessarily to be dependent on specific international assistance. So what we have done with displaced communities in the world is also to just give cash grants. And we have some excellent new programs where people can start, displaced populations can start their businesses because they get a grant from the ICRC. We don't intervene anymore just in following closely an economic pattern, but we would give cash grants. Some of it, as I mentioned, has been extremely successful. In Kachin State in Myanmar, I just visited a program where 2 years ago we have offered $200 to 2,000 families. And almost 90% of those 2,000 families today are on a self-sustaining business out of the $200 that we have made available. I mention these examples only in order also to stimulate some thinking on your side. If the world is roughly what the world is and which I tried to describe, a huge dynamic of violence and conflict, I think there are traditions coming from our traditional approach at ICRC which are still very accurate and topical to deal with those issues, and I mentioned why our work on the law with belligerent and negotiating access is important. But it is also innovation and new thinking and new ways of humanitarian assistance and protection which is particularly important. I have been just 3 weeks ago on the west coast of the United States to have 1 week of conversations with all the big digital companies of the world. And why did I take a week's time to talk to Microsoft and Facebook and Google and YouTube and Salesforce and all those companies? Because at the end of the day, we see a new frontier emerging where increasingly victims are also connected to the cyberspace and war is moving into the cyberspace. So we have to deal with those issues, and if governments are not ready to discuss the legal framework of violence and warfare in the cyberspace, companies are increasingly interested and are increasingly aware that their tools that they make available to civil society are at the same time used for violence and warfare, and therefore they are increasingly interested to engage with an organization like ICRC and reflect with us how can we contribute to control violence in the next generation of war and violence in the cyberspace, and how can we help humanitarian organization like the ICRC to modernize humanitarian assistance so that it can reach more people more effectively and more efficiently. So these are just some remarks from my side to introduce and to stimulate the discussion with you. And I suggest that from now on, I take 2 or 3 questions and I try to respond to some of the interest that you may have. Thank you very much.